Good morning, and I'm really glad that we have such a good turnout for this panel. I was thinking, the subject that hangs over almost every discussion that we have is Russia, and it comes up in so many different forms. And now we have a panel devoted specifically to Russia, so I'm very glad that we'll be able to do this with a very distinguished and experienced panel. You have their names, I think, in your books, but just to tell you who is who in order here, I'll start at the end. It is Dr. Lilia Shevtsova, who is the Associate Fellow of Russian and Eurasia Programs at Chatham House. Next to her is Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, Distinguished Fellow of the Atlantic Council, and of course has been our ambassador to NATO, our ambassador to Russia, and quite distinguished background, and we all know them personally, I'm sure. Next, coming out of, as he put it, deepest Brexitshire, is, that's not me, Keir dreamt that up, which I think is brilliant, is Keir Giles, who works with the Conflict Studies Research Center, and it has also written a great book that I've been reading on the way over across the Atlantic, Moscow Rules. And then we have Mr. Valeriy Solovej, Russian historian, and very glad to get a Russian perspective. And then finally, we have Mr. Schmidt, who's a member of the German Bundestag, federal minister retired, and president of the German Atlantic Association. And I'm Jill Dougherty. I've been here many times before. I am a former journalist who's turned into kind of more of an academic field. So I work both with the Wilson Center in Washington and with Georgetown University, the School of Foreign Service. So I'd like to begin. As you read the subject of our discussion today, it's managing the crisis. And obviously, there is a crisis. And listening to the conversations yesterday, the discussions, we were talking about the rules-based order. And I just wanted to, from my perspective, tell you I was in Sochi, Russia, just last week, and heard a lot about the rules-based order, and I thought I would inform you of what the view from Moscow is, which is very interesting. A report from Valeriy, the think tank which is associated with the Kremlin, but they do, I think, sometimes quite a good job. But here is their take on the liberal theory of world order. It features all the key tenets of the liberal theory to some degree, such as democracy, free trade, international institutions. Implicit in all of this, however, is the idea that the U.S. itself should play the leading role. And then in the discussions there, I have to say, if you put a headline on it, it's that the liberal democratic order is over, kaput. It means really nothing anymore. And we are into a chaotic world, perhaps, and a dangerous world where everybody does his own thing. So that's just kind of, I think, bringing that up helps me to kind of conceptually get to where we're going. But I asked our panel to say a few words, maybe about 5 minutes, short comments here at the top to answer the question that I have, which is, what is the greatest challenge or danger from this crisis that we are in? So maybe we start, Lilia, would you like to start since you're down there?
Why not? We are friends, so you're giving me the first word.
Absolutely.
Jill, thank you. And I would like to thank the hosts of the Riga Forum and you all folks, participants, for yesterday, for your tough, cold-blooded analysis of our problems and of our challenges, Russia challenge, that we cannot sort out. It's very useful, and I would say that I hope that Valeriy would agree with me that we Russians have to appreciate what the outside world is thinking about us. although sometimes it's very painful. Jill, if I may, I will turn your question into the list of paradoxes, just to add a couple of brushstrokes to yesterday's landscape of Russia. And of course, the fact that you mentioned Valeriy already presents a kind of a paradox. Yes, indeed, you listen to Russian political community and President Putin himself at Valeriy, and they were apparently enjoying their mantra about the liberal order and, of course, the biggest elephant of the world, the United States of America, going to the political cemetery. But inside, if you scratch the skin of the Russian political class, and I would say Putin himself, you'll find a different kind of moods. They definitely have growing fear, apprehension, that we are entering a kind of Jurassic world where only two big monsters will be domineering, the United States, maybe even with Trump, and China, that is heavily breathing behind our back. So it's a kind of paradoxical and very controversial thinking within the Russian political elite. And a couple of other paradoxes on my list. And I would like Brian Whitmore to continue this list when he is free. Firstly, the paradox on impotent omnipotence that I'm constantly turning in my head. I don't know what to do with that. Frustrating and very suicidal. Impotent omnipotence. On the one hand, the Russian president, according to the constitution, has all resources and powers in his hands. On the other hand, he cannot do anything. He cannot guarantee development. He cannot guarantee even security and stability. And moreover, he's doing suicidal statecraft because they're raising everything on the political scene, creating a kind of political Sahara desert. He, in fact, creates the situation when people, having no institutions and channels of articulation, have to go to the street and break the windows. Another paradox, I call it tentatively cognitive dissonance, also rather painful and disastrous for Russian mentality thing. Yes, on the one hand, the Russian political elite is living in the 19th century. They don't know how to rule themselves, to rule the country, and how to view the outside world. Only a war paradigm, only besieged fortress, only looking for the enemy. But on the other hand, and Jill, apparently you watched it, you observed it at Valeriy, Putin has become a rather peaceful political animal. The words that he said about Trump, Zelensky, Ukrainian President Zelensky, were so gracious. Definitely he's pressing another button right now, the button of dialogue, cooperation, reconciliation. And the West, together with Macron and some other folks, are rushing to embrace him. But bitter irony is that this reconciliation button, this kind of cooperation and dialogue policy on part of Russia is the most successful tool or instrument to undermine the West, to undermine the Western normative dimension, and to expand the possibilities for Russian kleptocracy that is personally integrated into your fabrics. The irony and paradox. One more paradox on my list, the paradox of confrontation and dialogue. Well, and one more paradox of, I would say, paradox of change. 70% of Russians, sometimes even 80%, they want change. They're fed up with the current situation. They want a new situation at home. They want some guarantees of future. They want some vision. And at the same time, there is fear. There is fear that any kind of change would repeat the situation of unraveling, situation of 1991, and not only Putin, but Russians themselves fear the collapse of the state, because nobody knows what will happen then after the collapse of the state. And besides, there is also apprehension that the new democratic and transformed Russia with a new image, Russia with a new foreign policy, cannot fit the current geographical format. So the state will be different. And nobody can predict what are the consequences of this unraveling. especially when the new rise in China, the new and modern superpower, are waiting patiently and consistently, or maybe impatiently, for our unraveling. And I've mentioned this paradox of confrontation and dialogue. I will end with that. What kind of paradox it is? Yes, on the one hand, the elite wants bickering, macho posturing, bullying. They want to fear the West. They want to scare the neighborhood. But on the other hand, there is another growing trend, and I wonder whether Valeriy will accept this, my view of the trend. The people within the elite, even kleptocracy, they want open borders. They want personal integration in the West. They want to continue to live in their Londongrad and to be richest people in Paris, Berlin, London, and Florida, and of course the state of Delaware. And 68% of Russians want peaceful relationship with the West. No. You know how many Russians would like the expansion that we discussed yesterday? 14%, 1-4. Do you know how many Russians, ordinary Russians, would like confrontation with the United States of America today with Trumpian America? 1-8, 18%. So there is totally different moods within the society. Yes, we are pathetic. We look pathetic because there is no political alternative or political force that can structure this peaceful mood. And this is our paradox. And there is, of course, the feeling and impression of hopefulness when we are talking about the moods within the society. But there is also feeling of lack of hope, of disaster, of suicidal end. Why? Because we fear what the change will bring us. And you have to fear too. And because we lost the icon. We liberals too. We lost the West as a role model. And without you folks returning to the role of the model, of the icon, of the goal, of the ultimate goal, because Russians, according to our national identity, cannot exist without this existential goal. We cannot do anything with us, with ourselves. Well, my optimistic conclusion that we are in your folks' hands.
Thank you, Lilia. You know, just one quick thing on that Putin reconciliation. I actually did see that at Valeriy because I asked a question about the...
Oh, so you asked the question, yeah?
The one about possible impeachment and how all of this political chaos in the United States could affect relations. And he was actually very mild. I expected more. And he pretty much sidestepped any controversy and said, you know, the United States it's an internal affair of the United States, and you have to deal, one cannot not deal with the United States. So anyway, interesting. And Ambassador Vershbow, what would you say? I mean, you've been up close, you know, for years looking at this. Know Russia's drivers of foreign policy. What would you like to contribute to this understanding?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jill, and it's a great pleasure to be back here at the Riga conference. I think the session is properly titled as Managing Crisis, because I put the emphasis on the managing, because I don't think fundamental change in the relationship is in the offing. And I think despite some of the softer rhetoric, talk of reconciliation, I don't think Russia's actually interested in doing what would be necessary to achieve a genuine improvement in the relationship. And that's despite the fact that many Western leaders, from Trump to Macron, may be talking reset again. I think they're very much deluding themselves. 6 years after the invasion of Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, I read the Russians as defiant as ever. They take no responsibility for tearing up the international rule book in what they did in Ukraine. In fact, they seem almost proud of it. They continue to refine their revisionist narrative about the evil West having conspired since 1989, maybe from even earlier, to weaken, to encircle, to enslave Russia, as Shoigu just said the other day, by imposing Western rules and values on Russia when it was weak. they basically dismiss all the efforts that we made in the 90s and into this century to establish a strategic partnership as just a smokescreen for efforts to marginalize Russia in terms of its role in the world and to promote regime change. And I think they use this narrative, which they believe, this is not just propaganda, they believe their own propaganda, that this is the underpinnings for their determined effort to redivide Europe based on spheres of influence, a system in which only the strong countries have real sovereignty. And the West is supposed to accept Russian hegemony over its former Soviet neighbors and its right to use force when necessary to block these countries' path towards the EU and NATO. So in effect, Russia sees itself at war with the West, and they're waging an active hybrid war against the US, against NATO, and of course against Ukraine and Georgia, with a view to discredit democracy itself, to divide our societies and corrupt our societies, as Brian Whitmore pointed out yesterday. And they're doing this partially as payback for the perceived slights that they feel Russia endured since 1989, and partially to reduce democracy's appeal to the Russian people, lest they start their own kind of color revolution. I think what's at root of the current impasse with Russia is that Putin fears Western ideas. I think he fears Western ideas much more than he fears NATO enlargement or the enhanced forward presence battalions here in the Baltic states, or anything else that NATO has been doing on the military side. Now, of course, the recent protests and Putin's declining political ratings suggest that this effort to discredit democracy isn't necessarily working, and that there's still some in Russia who are inspired to fight for their rights. But I don't think that we're near a tipping point, even though these developments may evolve over some years. I think Putin has a grip on the situation and is likely to maintain it, even if many people decide to emigrate, since they're the most susceptible to starting a color revolution. I think he's glad to see them go. Now, in addition to waging this hybrid war, Russia continues its provocative military behavior in the Black Sea, in the airspace here in the Baltic region. Of course, since its intervention in Syria in 2015, Russia has been flexing its muscles in many parts of the world, in Libya, in Venezuela, the Central African Republic. And I think the main objective here is to undermine US influence, to play the spoiler more than to actually try to solve any of the regional problems. In fact, Russia, I think, is basically saying Russia cannot be ignored. And if promoting chaos in the greater Middle East and in other parts of the world is what it takes to show the West that Russia can't be ignored, then it will continue to do so. And I think it sees this as a way to undermine American leadership and undermine the whole US-led international order in the spirit of, better no rules than following your rules. So I think you can already sense that I'm pretty skeptical that there's any real bargain, whether it's a grand bargain or a modest bargain, to be made with Putin right now. The current confrontational relationship in which Russia portrays itself as the besieged fortress facing a Russophobic West, I think that suits Putin's domestic needs, maintaining a low-level conflict in the Donbass rather than actually moving towards resolving it. Keeps the pressure on Ukraine, slows its reform progress, and ensures that the Russian people don't get any ideas to have their own Maidan. And of course, with the United States in turmoil over impeachment, with the EU focused mainly on internal questions, I don't think Putin sees now as the time when he has to really make any deals or make any concessions that might lead to a deal. Now, having said that, we shouldn't be fatalistic or passive. We should engage Russia, but from a position of strength, which means continuing to implement the decisions NATO has taken over the last 5-6 years on defense and deterrence, including implementing the NATO Readiness Initiative, I think, which is a key to ensuring that the battalions here in the Baltic states can get the reinforcements they need in a crisis. We should, of course, maintain the sanctions, which continue to have an impact, and are at least contributing to the economic stagnation that is beginning to alarm the Russian people and parts of the elite. We should do protective things such as working on election security and reducing our vulnerability to Russian disinformation and cyber attacks. When it comes to the Donbass, we should continue to back Ukraine, including militarily, in its efforts to deter any further Russian aggression, reduce the violence, support President Zelensky's efforts to reach out to the population in the occupied territories. We should certainly explore whether the talk of the Steinmeier formula provides some kind of opening that could lead to the withdrawal of Russian troops and return of Ukrainian troops to the international border. But I'm skeptical that Putin is prepared to go that far. The Russian interpretation of the Steinmeier formula is that elections should be held while the Russian forces are still there, and that's not any basis for delivering on what Minsk was all about. I hope my country can turn back to the policy of supporting Ukraine and that they can find a good replacement for Kurt Volker, whose departure is a big loss for diplomatic efforts. But at the end of the day, even with concerted diplomatic efforts and coordination between Europe and the United States and with Kiev, Putin may ultimately judge that the status quo is just fine, and perhaps the best we can hope for is a more effective ceasefire with fewer people dying on a daily basis than is the case now. Now, beyond the Donbass, I think our focus, as I said, should be on managing what is going to be a competitive relationship for the foreseeable future. In that regard, we should take a look at the Cold War toolbox and see whether there are things that we can try to do when it comes to arms control, confidence building measures, risk reduction measures, to try to at least stabilize the relationship, minimize the risk of conflict, promote greater predictability and transparency in military activities, and encourage Russia to scale back some of its more provocative activities and its large military exercises. There's a lot of material to draw from, but such as strengthening the Vienna document. I think we should consider reviving the military-to-military dialogue in the NATO-Russia Council to both avoid misperceptions, but also start talking about the implications of new military technologies. But at the end of the day, Putin may still prefer to be provocative and non-transparent. But nevertheless, we should challenge him at the bargaining table, particularly in the OSCE, to see whether there's ways to kind of reduce the level of competition and the risks of confrontation. There's more specifics I could talk about, but I'll stop there. But I think that we have to accept that we're in a strategic competition for the long haul, and I don't see any pressures on Putin from within or without that is likely to encourage him to start rebuilding the international order that Russia so seriously damaged with its aggression against Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, in fact, a lot at the end, I think we do want to devote several minutes to what can be done, if anything. Keir, you're up next, and reminding the question is the greatest challenge or danger from this crisis. You have kind of a different take on it, which I thought was interesting, not necessarily, it's more, some of it focused on what the West is doing or not doing, but feel free to set us up with your view of this challenge.
Thanks, Jill. Certainly it may look like a different take, but actually my answer to that question, what's the biggest challenge and danger, follows on quite naturally from Ambassador Vershbow's. He's explained how we should not expect any change in Russian policy or attitude in the near future. My question is, why should we? Why would they change their foreign or domestic policy or attitudes when they're receiving so much encouragement from Western nations that actually this is a successful and sustainable policy for the long term? When there are so many actions and statements and signals that provide a background against which Russia can assume that it can continue in this pattern and reap successes without costs or consequences. And I'm talking primarily about things that are driven by the restless urge by Western nations to reset the relationship without addressing the basic issues that are problems and contradictions and incompatibilities within it. To paper over the cracks and to proceed with business as usual without dealing with the fundamental problems in the relationship to start with. And we see time and again these signals are repeated. If we just take a few examples from the last few weeks and consider how they will be read in Moscow. There's the Emmanuel Macron mini reset attempt, which we hear is already running into difficulties and frustrations, which is an entirely predictable development from anybody that's followed the previous pattern of state resets with Russia. There's Ukrainian adoption of the Steinmeier formula, which follows in this fine old tradition of larger Western powers imposing on the victims of Russian aggression a ceasefire agreement which was either drafted in Moscow or its terms composed there. And in addition to that, there's another final tradition of the terms of that ceasefire agreement being so ambiguous or opaque that Russia comes up with an entirely different interpretation of exactly what is meant. So now that we have been hearing for so long that the Steinmeier formula is the only way forward for peace in Ukraine, and there's finally acceptance of that, we scramble to work out what exactly it means in precisely the same way as we did before that in Georgia and in Syria. Draft ceasefires in Moscow, and you end up with documents with loopholes in them big enough to drive tanks through. And moving on, what else do we have? The mood music across Europe. Interview by Finnish Foreign Minister Pekka Haavisto, in a prominent one in the Financial Times, saying Russia has to be an indispensable part of the solution to world problems and global crises and regional crises as well. Now, he may have meant we have to bear in mind that we have to talk to Russia and build bridges to them because they are a member of the Permanent Five in the Security Council and therefore have a veto, therefore we cannot discount what they say. However, that did not make it through into the final text of what he has broadcast to the world. Instead, it will be read in Moscow, as it was by many people in my country, as saying, Russia is right to intervene in crises militarily, because therefore they make themselves indispensably a part of the solution and something to be reckoned with, which fulfills so many state aims of Moscow. And then, of course, there's the United States. Now, I'm not going to be talking about the non-traditional relationship between the presidents of the United States and Russia. Enough has been written and said about that, and the dangers of that are clear enough. But there's another difficulty, and that is the dissonance between White House declaratory policy and aims and US policy it is actually implemented day to day on a working level. And that is dangerous because it is confusing, not just for allies and for the United States itself, but also for Russia. Now, we've heard for years now already, from the United States military in particular, watch what we do, not what we tweet. In other words, White House declaratory policy may not actually have such a direct impact on the day-to-day workings of the United States with allies and with Russia as we might fear. But it has still been a source of confusion and potentially of miscalculation in dangerous situations because it leads to unpredictability. And now, just over the last few days, we have seen that tenuous link come devastatingly unstuck. The difference between United States policy as it is supposed to be and the priorities and approaches of the White House have caused serious consequences in Ukraine and in Syria, all of which will provide still further encouragement to Moscow, particularly in the Syria case, because a decision by a US president to abandon allies in favor of a regional strong power who harbors hostile intent towards them sets an exceptionally dangerous precedent. Even if that precedent is not followed elsewhere, and heaven forbid that it should be followed in this part of the world, it still serves secondary Russian objectives. It sows doubt. It undermines confidence. It makes people ask themselves questions about the relationship with the United States that have not been asked for decades. And as such, it serves this key Russian aim of making the Atlantic just that little bit wider and making people on this side of it just that little bit less confident in truths and relationships and faiths that they had held for so long. Put all of it together and you get a consistent pattern. As I said, consider how this looks to Moscow. Put all of the mood music, put all of the background noise, put all of the small statements and actions together, and it is a very consistent pattern. And this comes back to my first point. How would this not encourage Russia to continue down the path that it has chosen? How will it not encourage Russia to think that it is stronger and more capable than it actually is, and that it can continue to act in ways that ought to be unacceptable to the West and not suffer long-term costs and consequences as a result?
Thank you, thank you. So I'm getting a fuller picture. I have the map of Russia, map of Europe, the United States, and I'm filling in now the picture. But now I want to go to Moscow and to get the perspective from Valeriy on Putin's perspective. Where is Putin coming from? Feel free to say as much as you want about this.
Thank you. When we're discussing Russia, we're discussing Putin first. It's clear because Putin himself is a main driver and mastermind of the country, foreign policy and global strategy. But what drives Mr. Putin himself? I think that his policy thinking is a result of the combined influence of the three main factors: Russia's traditional strategic culture, his identity of the former officer of the Soviet KGB, and maybe the most intriguing one is his strong messianic complex and inclination to mysticism. Two elements of Russian strategic culture are the most important. First, the recognition of the post-Soviet space as a sphere of Russian influence, and Ukraine has a special importance. And second is the idea of strategic patience. And I think that it is probably the most important and prominent element in Russian strategic culture. And the idea is very simple. Russia can wait until the West would be tired. But there is a new element now, not to wait a window of opportunity, but to create it, to prepare this window of opportunity for achieving Russian strategic goals. And I must say that Russia's policy in Europe in general can be understood as such a preparation of window of opportunity. Regarding corporate identity, the former Soviet KGB, foreign policy is viewed in a paranoid light. Any unfavorable or unacceptable actions for Russia are perceived as a Western-inspired conspiracy. For example, all anti-government and anti-presidential propaganda in the Russian segment of social media are considered to be inspired by the Western intelligence. So what's the conclusion? To switch off them in the case of strong political crisis. And second, the methods employed by the intelligence services now are tools of the Russian policy abroad. Regarding messianic complex, Putin himself believes that he is President the Savior, who raised Russia from its knees, restored its power, and that he is led by the Lord himself. And this is his very strong personal belief. But more important, that he thinks that his messianic mission also includes such an element as changing the world, especially Europe. And in his personal perspective, geopolitical dynamics he initiated in the, 5 years ago from Crimea has not finished yet. And the forthcoming year may play an important role in a new tour of Russian geopolitical game. Who is the most important ally of the West in Russia? But it may surprise you, but not Russian civil society, not Russian liberals, but the Russian elite in general, including the Putin's inner circle, because the Russian elite is tired is tired because of his geopolitical adventurism. And it would like prefer to enjoy its status, wealth, and lifestyle without internal restrictions and Western sanctions. So Western sanctions doesn't influence Russian policy, but they influence a Russian mood of the Russian elite first. And Putin must take it into account. A very interesting example. You know, perhaps, that there is a formal ban in Russia for the officers of security, service, and police to rest abroad. But this summer, you could meet many high-ranking officers, including personal Putin's guard of the Coast d'Azur this year, because this ban doesn't work. And some practical conclusions. President Putin is ready to resolve crisis, yes, but only on his own terms. Just as Russia, the Kremlin thinks that he is very close to resolving Donbass crisis on Russian terms. But in general, Putin prefers to maintain a chaos. He believes chaos to be the best way to create a window of opportunity and achieve Russia and his personal goals. And I must add, the main goal to change the world, not only to save Russia. And practical aspect, two bad signs, possible bad signs. If Putin replaces the present heads of the defense ministry and the Federal Security Service with the younger generals, or at least if we can see an emergence of the big groups of young generals in these two bodies. And the second sign, especially for our Latvian hosts, if the TV channel of the defense ministry Zvezda, Star, instead of discussing Ukraine, starts a campaign against discrimination and persecution of the Russian population in the Baltic states. Thank you. Follow it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much. Christian, you're our European representative here, so maybe there's a different perspective. I mean, I do think that Russia is part of Europe, but I won't get into that because that is a wieczna problema. But in any case, Christian, so tell me what your perspective, filling in again the blank over here on the map, from your perspective, what is the biggest challenge or threat coming from this?
Jill, thank you very much. First of all, I'm very glad to be back on Riga conference, because this is geographically a place where we are in midst of Europe, but we feel the challenge of cooperation or non-cooperation with the Russian Federation very, very intensely. So first, I would say what Europeans do not want to have, or me, is, and so this is, I'm happy to be on the panel, not to have a Reykjavik-style discussion about the future of Europe, where in this good old time, should I say, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan set aside. Today they could not, because you already worked out that today's world is not the world of 1986. It's to talk about China and to talk about United States. And this very uncomfortable situation of the Russian Federation being blamed by an American president, Barack Obama, as a regional power, feeling that this is something, a declining description, a description of declining, but it is more than a regional power. It has a lot of potentials, and somehow it is in between. And this brings me a little bit back to the history of my own country. Germany was the German Empire, too large, too strong to fail, but it was not able really to find its place inside the nations of Europe. And maybe the last was Bismarck, when he said never ever have a two-front confrontation. Unfortunately, the emperors, later emperors, they missed this message. and others. But today, it is a description of somebody who is in between others and not able really to dominate, but also not able just to play the third violin. And this is maybe one of the also sentimental problems where we have a lot of misconceptions in Europe and in Russia and in other places of the world about what? About the misconception that Russia is, and we have heard about this very intensely, Mr. Putin, is at the end of just forming a better state economically and so on. He failed economically because he did not manage the transformation with the huge potential of energy, of gas and others, to an economic and post-industrial economy. So there is a dependence on others. And if I would ask and look what are the challenges for Russia, probably the new crisis could be Greta Thunberg. Why? We are accustomed to discuss about Nord Stream 2, about the challenge to keep the Ukraine in the consequence of keeping energy supply from the Russian Federation. This is what has to be discussed in this year and up to end of this year. And this is, by the way, as I have read some release of a phone call between two presidents, probably somebody did not inform the American president fully that there is a lot of European commitment financially and politically to the Ukraine, including hoping that now Zelensky and his new start probably could bring us with the Normandy format and the Minsk to some slight steps better than now. But be it via Nord Stream or via other pipelines, the stuff in the pipelines is not the stuff of the future of energy in Europe. And so Putin should look around what are his neighbors. Now he started to have exercises together with the Chinese. I don't know exactly what it was about. The other exercises the Russian military is doing makes us not very confident, because if it's right that the nuclear option is not only a political option used in these exercises, but used as a tool. So I think we see that we have to go on an intense dialogue about world order, about rule-based orders, especially not being like we have with the INF misconception that there would be going out. We should not see this with New Start. So let's start about talking about the New Start, and on eye level, try to get the Russians in. If there are three powers, and a fourth in between, what is the European Union, which is on the way to understand that there is a need of positioning. I agree with you that sanctions are not a strategy. Sanctions are an answer. We are lacking a little bit of strategy, what we do want to have with beyond Crimea, with possibility of having some agreement with the Russian Federation. We should work on it. The Russians or Putin should not underestimate the experience in Europe and in NATO after the Crimea occupation. The 2% discussion, which has been raised in Wales, which is an elder one, but would not have led to statement of Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, the German new Minister of Defense, yesterday, to say up to the end of the 20s or 2030, we will have the 2%. And we have just increased in Germany our defense budget in the last 5 years to 40%. So this is in a country where you have to explain to everybody that you are just starting to buy one gun. This is a very, very a large step, showing that the consciousness in Europe and my country that there is a challenge is going on. This is not yet a strategy, but we need to have a defense strategy and twofold, and the offer of dialogue and the offer of economic cooperation, because this is the weakest part of the Russian of Putin, is that he is depending on such few economic pillars that I think he will not bring his country into a good future without cooperation with whom? With the Chinese? Normally, if there are two big ones, as I repeat, and a regional power, it is not about a multilateralism. In our experience, and Russia especially, as Henry Kissinger said already in the early 90s, that the Russian experiences, that Russian leaders are tending to think in imperial categories. So the imperial categories, there is no sufficient potential for Russia to be an empire. It is in need of cooperation. I don't know whether Putin is on the way to develop such a kind of understanding, but we should offer an environment where such understanding could find a place. And this is, on my understanding, come back to Reykjavik, that we Europeans, together with the Americans, should do two things. First, strengthen the American side to make clear that world strategy is not about gambling and kidding about Robert Mueller and personal interests of anybody, including the president. That there is a responsibility of the United States of America to go beyond their understanding of America first. There's a responsibility in their own interest. We see sometimes now, as we heard yesterday, that the trade and customs conflict with China seems on one stage to, referring to Twitter, getting in a kind of solution. Let's wait and see. But I think we have to get readjusted our transatlantic relation, not from the side of the Europeans. They will do their business, but from the side of the US. And a joint offer to Russia to be part of a development strategy of finding a place for Russia more than a regional power, a very influential part of regional stability, global stability. I think this could be one, should be one important one. The second is between transatlantic and the other, both the Russian Federation. I do not see that China has a full interest in finding Russia as the first ally. So there we are. We Europeans have to understand that the challenge is not only symbolic or just virtual. This is where I see that a new European Commission, and now after all the turmoil we had in the European Union, could go on a little bit better. In understanding of security and defense, we have to see, looking on our European side, that we have to manage definitely to keep the Brits in the security area as a full member of European responsibility. We have the NATO framework and we have the NATO responsibility. This is first and foremost. But I think that in the understanding that some Russian ideas, there could be the DVD at Impera, a better place, give a better place to play an important role, should not be feeded. And this is, we have heard about this, the misconceptions in Russia could come, and we have a lot of misconceptions about the Russian understanding about the future. So it's on us to be more strictly, more strongly, but offering the possibility to talk and to make clear, to end with Helmut Schmidt, that if economic change or adaptation in a time of the Kondratiev of digitalization does not come to Europe and to the Russian Federation, the Russian Federation could probably go where it not should go to. And Helmut Schmidt said in the times of Cold War where it was, as Upper Volta with missiles.
And on that,
thank you.
You know, this is a very big panel, and so I'm the traffic cop here looking at the time, and we have 34 minutes and 12 seconds left. I want to give questions to the audience, but if our panelists could be extremely brief, but I think it really is an important issue, which is, and Christian began to talk about this, there are other players. I mean, China, but there are many other players now that can get into and exert their, power politics. Many different countries, in fact, smaller countries, or even sometimes citizens or groups who can use, let's say, the internet or digital means to project their interests, etc. I'd like to talk, since the Russians last week were talking a lot about the rest of the world, the multipolar world, and the influence of other countries. Really, if you could keep it brief. But I guess the final way I would say this is Russia is not alone. We tend to focus on it as Russia and the West. But there are a whole lot of other power centers out there that are becoming stronger every day. So how does this influence how the West should relate to Russia? And if you could keep it very brief. Anybody want to jump in?
Me?
Sandy?
Yep.
Sure.
Okay. Indeed, it's, of course, there's many other players who are disrupting the international systems, and Russia is more and more aligned with them. At the same time, we could be doing a better job in kind of engaging directly, and I think right now the U.S. policy towards China is driving China and Russia closer together. The trade war, sort of the direct challenges that we're making to China's position in East Asia. So I think part of the effort to convince the Russians that they need to modify their behavior is to try to sort of reduce their ability to hide behind some of their friends, or even engage in kind of joint provocative behavior like we've seen recently in their air operations over Korea and Japan. But at the end of the day, I think we have to do a better job in creating the pressure on Russia to recognize that time is not on its side, that ultimately taking steps to undo some of the damage that it has inflicted, particularly dealing with Donbass. I consider the Donbass as the sort of litmus test of whether Russia is interested in restoring some kind of cooperative relationship or not. We can create leverage through other relationships, but ultimately the Russians are going to have to make a choice.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else on the panel want to care?
Certainly, yes. Let me pick up on that last point you made, that Russia is not alone, because there is another danger, which we see again and again, which is underestimating the appeal of the Russian model around the world. And that's both to states and sometimes even to populations. There are aspects of how Russia comports itself and manages its business internationally and domestically, which actually do look like attractive patterns to follow for other countries. If you take, for example, the ongoing conversation about the balance between information security on the one hand and cybersecurity and freedom of expression. We've taken it for granted for so long that freedom of expression is sacrosanct, but there are plenty of other countries out there that think actually the Russian model is the way to go, and that expresses itself sometimes very clearly when it comes to plain votes, choosing between the two different systems. And then the other aspect of this post-liberal world that Russia is portraying, not just the post-Western order, but also, as they say, the eclipse of liberal extremism. That has an appeal for populations. If you voted for Trump or voted for Brexit or Orban or Ekre, then you are in tune with Russia's message about how liberal extremism is a dangerous fad that has now passed. So when you mentioned that we work in deepest Brexitshire, shortly after the Brexit referendum, when the cosmopolitan elites in London and the media were still wailing and gnashing their teeth and saying, how could this possibly have happened? It was in fact Vladimir Putin who put his finger on precisely the sentiment of British voters that had registered their votes in protest against everything that he was complaining about too. And that is a message that even if it does not directly reach populations, does still resonate. And we've already mentioned Greta Thunberg, another point which emphasizes for President Putin how the real challenges that he presents to the West are not taken seriously, is the outrage that has greeted his daring to criticize Saint Greta, which is at least as much as the outrage of attacking Ukraine.
Lilia.
Just very, very brief, because Keir provoked me together with Sandy. If other countries try to emulate, to follow Russia's pattern, this means that Christian is absolutely right, saying that we need to fight with fallacies and misperceptions regarding Russia's role and Russia's tactical successes. Because, well, in fact, what we see that Russia gives an absolutely amazing example of law of unintended consequences. We've been fighting with NATO, and we brought the revival of NATO. We've been trying to return back Ukraine to our hot and sexual embraces, and we lost Ukraine nation as our little brother. We tried even to sponsor the right-wing and left-wing parties in Europe, and what are the successes? Finally, we tried to pursue the big Eurasia concept that Giles was listening about at Valeriy, and we brought the situation when even Lukashenko is trying to hide from us, and Kazakhs are trying consolation in Chinese hands. So yes, we have to fight misperceptions about our tactical successes.
Mm-hmm. And Christian, I know you wanted to say briefly something.
Just wanted to add in the Keir's observation about Syria and the situation there, that we have to see that it is necessary to understand that relations to Russia are not only made on direct relations. It is the failure of, let me say, the Western side to prevent the civil war or whatever it is in Syria to such a situation as we are today, describes the lack of Western leadership. And if there is Western leadership, I could not see that Mr. Putin just likes to see Mr. Assad as his best friend.
Yeah, no.
He has just taken the opportunity of filling a vacuum. And so let us sit and then think about our commitment in international crisis situation of Western contribution, first of all, I know, to the United States of America.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you have one thing,
yes,
Valeriy?
Yes. Yes, just a brief remark. All Russian alliances, ideas about alliance with China, activities in the East and so on, have only one topic: to influence the West.
To what? I'm sorry?
To influence the West, to deal with the West, to have better position to deal with the West. Because the Kremlin is afraid of China. The Kremlin doesn't trust Iran and does trust any Eastern potential, as we call them, strategic partners. but to deal with the West is the main problem.
Okay. Well, our time is 25 minutes and 48 seconds, and we have questions that will probably take another hour, but let's begin. Let's begin with the gentleman right here. Do we have a microphone, second row? Thank you. And if you could identify yourself just briefly.
Yes, Klaus Wittmann, Senior Fellow, Aspen Institute, Germany, and Potsdam University, a former general. And I have to add that I'm also a member of the European Leadership Network that has pronounced several also public statements about crisis management and avoiding incidents, etc., between Russia and NATO. I have a question which I would have liked to pose to Minister Pabriks yesterday, but I didn't get the chance, but it also fits here. As one who severely criticizes Russia's aggressive policy and action and who agrees with very much of what Sandy Vershbow said, I still believe that we should make much better use of the NATO-Russia Council, which in my view should indeed have been sitting quasi in permanence since the outbreak of the Ukrainian crisis as a means of crisis management. And I would have said to Mr. Pabriks, I know that some of our Eastern allies see this differently and more critically, but I would point out that talking to the Russians does not mean rewarding them. But of course it cannot be dialogue for dialogue's sake. And a couple of months ago in Berlin, I had the chance to say to the NATO Secretary General in such a meeting that I would like to see NATO spell out much more imaginatively its offer reiterated at Warsaw in the framework of the Armel philosophy, dialogue on the basis of firmness. But dialogue about what?
Okay, thank you for that comment. Questions? There's a gentleman right in the middle. Can you see? Yeah? Yes? And then you. And then a younger man back there.
Hamid Lajawardi. First, I'd like to thank the panels for sharing their thoughts with us today. Based on what I've heard over the last day or so, Prime Minister Keir talked about the negotiating style of Russia versus Europeans, as when there's a conflict, both sides step back in Europe, give space, and then begin to negotiate their differences. His idea was that if the Europeans step back, Russia steps forward, so there's no room for really negotiation, which comes down to the idea that what a professor of mine said in university about the Soviet way of negotiating: what is mine, and what is yours is negotiable.
And is there a question?
And so the question becomes this. Are there people in the Kremlin who are thinking, how can we manage the relationship with the West, which doesn't include, if you will, my way or the highway?
Okay. Valeriy, do you have, I see two Russians, so Valeriy or Lilia?
Let Valeriy says about inside Kremlin. I will tell about outside Kremlin.
As far as I know, they're ready to play on the brink of the war. They're ready. I think that this is the essence of my answer. At the same time, of course, they would prefer to avoid war, but they're ready. And the only country the Kremlin is afraid of, really, besides China, is the United States. Putin personally respects the US might, US capacity, and deeply respects President Trump. And at the same time, he deeply and consistently despises all the European leaders.
Well,
He believes they are clowns. And he is absolutely sure in his superiority and in his possibility to deceive them.
Lilia, do you...
Just one sentence. You know, it seems to me there will be, and there should be, but there will be a way of new style of negotiation on the side of the Kremlin, but only under one condition: if there is coherent and united West with a vision of their own agenda.
Yeah.
Okay, and I know, Christian, you had
I just
two
can
words.
underline what you just have said as your last sentence. General Wittmann, I agree. The NATO Russian Council should be used, but we have to go in with a clear message and understanding. Being here in the Baltics and knowing about air policing and the experiences we have about Russian attitudes in the air and on sea, there is a need to give a very, very clear position and answer. And sometimes NATO did not show sufficiently what should be on discussion, in the sense that this is ours and it's not to be negotiated.
Ambassador Vershbow, were you raising your hand?
Yeah, to Klaus Wittmann's question, I share the sort of sense of regret that the NATO-Russia Council isn't more effective. I mean, we did revive the dialogue at the political level and even tried to challenge the Russians to get more serious about some of these confidence-building measures like the Vienna document, but they basically resisted. As I said before, they prefer to be unpredictable rather than agree to new measures of predictability. But we should keep trying, and I do think there's a justification, even though the overall policy, I think, is right, that we shouldn't have business as usual while they're still engaged in aggression against Ukraine. But I think on the military-to-military dialogue, there is a case for beginning to talk to the Russians about artificial intelligence and the implications of cyber defense. I mean, these are areas where there's no rules of the road, and I think it'd be in our interest to try to engage the Russians before these new technologies are reality. And as for the Russian negotiating style, we're seeing a classic example with the INF situation, where the Russians violate the treaty by deploying an illegal missile, and then they call for a moratorium, which would be basically freeze their unilateral advantage. But I think we need to turn the tables on them, and I think that's where the U.S. administration is, with its anti-arms control bias. We should come up with some kind of counter-proposal for a successor to INF, which would, for example, ban the nuclear version of this new Russian missile, given that NATO doesn't intend to develop nuclear missiles anyway, and see whether we can get the Russians to put this illegal missile under such a constraint, so at least we'd only be dealing with conventionally armed versions. So we should turn the tables on the Russians rather than just accept that what's mine is mine and what's yours is negotiable.
Mm-hmm. Keir, do you have something very briefly? Because I do want to get some more questions.
Then we'll move on.
Okay, let's do it. There was a gentleman, yes, right in the middle, white shirt, red tie, to distinguish him from all the other gentlemen here. But he's younger. Could you pass it to the middle, please? No offense. I think that was you. Oh, good. Okay.
Okay.
My name is Marina Timchenko. I'm from Ukraine. I'm a Ukrainian student. And my question goes to His Excellency Ambassador Vershbow. It's been the second day of this conference, and when it comes to the settlement of the war between Russia and Ukraine, it's all about Donbass and Minsk implementation and Steinmeier's formula. And I would like to bring Crimea back on the table, because there is zero progress on that, despite ongoing militarization of the peninsula. There is no formula on Crimea, and to be honest, Russia does not want to talk about it. So can we expect greater support from the West, and in particular from the United States, on that issue to launch the process of returning Crimea back to Ukraine, and in terms of greater political pressure on Russia, economic sanctions, and other efforts? Thank you.
Ambassador Vershbow?
Yes, certainly the focus right now is on the place where there's the active fighting, where people are dying every week, and trying to get the Russians to get more serious about what they agreed to do under Minsk is where we're focused. And I think that the challenge for the West will be not to, even in the best case where we have a solution in Donbass and Ukrainian sovereignty is restored, that the Russians get the impression that Crimea has been forgotten. I don't want to give you any illusion that we see a sort of a near-term way of restoring Crimea to Ukraine, but that'll be a longer-term challenge. But we should make clear that the West will be unified in having a long-term non-recognition policy, as we did with the Baltic states, and maintain at least some of the pressure of sanctions that were imposed for the annexation of Crimea, and make clear to the Russians that in the long term there'll be no full-fledged restoration of business as usual as long as this major violation of international law still exists. But again, this is going to take years. I don't think we should kid ourselves that there's any quick fix. But what ultimately is agreed in Donbass, it may provide a precedent, particularly if it involves a transitional arrangement with UN peacekeepers and an international administration as a way, a step away from Russian occupation towards the restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty. It may not happen all in one go. What we do in Donbass might ultimately be applicable to solving Crimea.
Okay. I like to do individual questions, but I think what I'm going to try to do is have about 3 questions, and then the panel could, if you have them directed to somebody, please say. If not, we can just very quickly jump in, whoever wants to. We have a military, an officer there.
Thank you. I'm Commander Engelen. I'm the head of the EU section at the Belgian Defense Strategy Department and also a lecturer in international politics at the Graduate School of Law here in Riga. And something that Mr. Solovej said about Vladimir Putin's personal ambition triggered this question, and I would be interested in his vision, but also in Dr. Shevtsova's vision. And it builds on the principle of missionist exceptionalism in international relations. And I would like to know Vladimir Putin's narrative that he's invested with a sacred mission to protect Russia against decadent Western values. Is that a genuine and sincere political objective, or is that merely a strategic communication trick to justify that you can disregard international law and established rules when it serves a higher moral goal? Thank you.
Okay. Let's answer that, because I think that is a fascinating question. Valeriy.
Yes, unfortunately for us, it is his sincere confession. Sincere. It is not a trick. He really believes in this. He really. And, well, it's very difficult to explain you their mindset. During my relations to these guys, for a long time I was sure that they were joking. No, they were absolutely serious about the Western conspiracy, about the Western involvement into Russian affairs, and about the Western aim to undermine stability in the country and to overthrow Mr. Putin personally.
Okay, other questions? Yes, right there.
Hello, thank you. I'm Philip. I'm an undergraduate student from Germany. And I have a question because you put it so eloquently. You said that when we discuss Russia, we discuss Putin. But Putin won't always rule Russia. So how could a NATO policy regarding Russia look post-Putin?
Who would like to answer that? Probably everybody. But does anybody want to jump in? Valeriy, you're always in the hot seat when it comes to questions about Mr. Putin. But who would like to try to answer that? Let's do. Keir, you have your hand up.
Yeah, it's very simple and very brief. To assume that there'll be a different policy post-Putin assumes that there'll be a different Russia post-Putin. Why would we think that Russia would change simply on the departure or possibly relocation of its president, when President Putin is not inventing most of what is going on? He is simply enacting deeply held and permanent Russian responses to internal and external challenges. This is Russia returning to its historical default settings rather than inventing any new policy. It's restoring Russian norms after the anomalous period that we saw after the end of the Cold War. So the patterns of behavior that we see now being reimposed and the hostility that Russia is showing to the West to its neighbors and to its own population is absolutely perfectly normal for Russia. It does not depend on the personality of President Putin. The precise manner in which it's implemented does, of course, and the messianic mission of Russia, saving, I would suggest, not just Russia, but also the world, if it is at all possible, is a particularly distinctive flavor of that. But the behaviors overall are perfectly normal, and we should not expect them to cease if there is a sudden departure of Vladimir Putin.
Mm-hmm. Valeriy, do you?
Yes, frankly speaking, I am more optimistic. I'm not waiting for a liberal government after Mr. Putin leaves us, and I think he leaves us earlier than many of us suppose, and before the year 24. But at least we'll receive a more reliable, more predictable, and more rational and pragmatic government in Russia. And it will provide a new mode of relations with the West. Maybe not in political, because we have a very fundamental mistrust, mutual mistrust, but at least in business. In business and in some other spheres, but not in politics. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
I would agree with that. I mean, I certainly agree that the basic worldview of Russia isn't going to change when Putin departs the scene, but I think there is the possibility that a successor regime may not have this messianic complex that Putin has, and may be more easily influenced by the West if we choose the right policies to create incentives to move away from confrontation, incentives to go back to the kinds of economic reforms that Putin has shied away from, turn inward. You know, we can create incentives for that while maintaining deterrence and containment to make clear that the status quo is going to mean continued stagnation for Russia.
I would, if I would just assist my German fellow in the intention, I'm optimistic. Not because I think there will be the new white elephant and doing only peaceful cooperation with everybody. But our experience was, what was Gorbachev about? Gorbachev, Glasnost and Perestroika was an answer to the end of a development in the Soviet situation, and he wanted to solve inside the system. He felt that this was not a way, and the history shows that he had to change fully. Yeltsin was somebody who turned his face towards the West. He did not do it successfully, but with some steps. Now, then we all, nobody, maybe you, but the insightful people in the West, they had never heard about Putin, about this KGB resident in Dresden, Germany, and his personal charisma, just to do what is he understands and what you described as his message. If the economic and political framework would give more pressure to the actual situation in Russia, knowing that the Russian people, I think if Yuki is a people who has learned or knows how it is to suffer and to stay to its commitments. But if I could imagine that somebody whom we do not know actually, who is born for sure, but we do not know him or her, will be able to have another step, probably facing more towards the West, when the bitter realistic situation will be that China is not the answer to a kind of cooperation or better times for Russia. So just a little bit optimism.
Dr. Shevtsova, you have studied this for many, many years. You have to say something.
Well, 5 topics. You know what? I totally agree with you. We have to get rid of this Putin's obsession. And sometimes when we are talking about Putin, it means that we are lacking readiness, ability to discuss much more complicated and adequate things. And I would agree with my colleagues on the panel that post-Putin's Russia apparently is the most hot and urgent topic for us. And the conflict is approaching between the traditional gang that surrounds Mr. Putin now And Putin, I would agree with Valeriy, he's living. Maybe today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, in 5 years' time, but he's gone. Politically, he is gone already. He has buried himself politically. So the future of Russia, it's Russia's trajectory, will be solved between, this rather shrinking group of coterie around him and pragmatic part of the elite that starts to consolidate itself. In the regions, by the way, too. And most important is that apparently about 50, 55, 60% of Russian population will be ready to support the new line, which means the new paradigm Valeriy and Christian were talking about, and Keir said it too.
Okay, I know we could continue, but we have about 5 more minutes. Let's take a question. There's a gentleman right there holding up, well, there are 2, but now, yes, sir, is there a microphone over there? Hold up your card, thank you.
I'm Linas, representing Baltic Defense College. Let me start my question with the quote. I would like to quote Mr. Linas Linkevičius, Lithuanian Foreign Affairs Minister, who yesterday said that Russia is not the superpower, but the super problem. So question then is, in order to solve the problem, so we have to have the common understanding and we have to frame the problem. So how then to solve the problem if I see so diverse understanding of the problem? So could you elaborate on that?
That's a good last question because it kind of gives us a question of what we do. We only have about 4 minutes left, but I'm sure our illustrious panel can make it very concise. How would you answer that question? And maybe we use that as a summation of your comments. Thank you.
Maybe I will start with one sentence. Practice what you preach, and you'll help us.
Yes. A little bit more?
I will give you. Sandy will continue.
Okay. Alexander Vershbow, please.
Yeah, well, I think we, first of all, need to continue to contain Russia, doing the things that we've been doing with NATO's defense posture, and at the same time, reducing our own vulnerabilities to Russian information warfare, to cyber warfare, and the like. But I think, I would say, if it's a kind of short answer, is we have to compete better with Russia. I mean, we have created openings for Russia that it's exploited in Syria, even in Venezuela, and we're not doing a very good job in terms of unifying the West and coming up with a more effective counter. So Putin went in probably only intending to save Assad, but he's kind of achieved what he thinks is a strategic success because we haven't come up with a coherent policy to actually end the conflict in Syria. And Russia doesn't care whether it ends the conflict in Syria. It's sowing chaos, I think others have said, is good enough to undermine U.S. leadership and the West. So we have to compete better and get our own house in order so the Russian interference is less successful. And ultimately, the internal contradictions that face Putin at home will catch up with him.
Okay, Keir.
All of those are absolutely critical steps because Russia will move into vacuums of political will or societal cohesion or even of military power. But there's an underlying problem that has to be addressed in order for that to happen. It is the one you alluded to. It is the failure to be open and transparent and honest about precisely what the problem is. The failure to have an open dialogue about the very basic and fundamental contradictions and incompatibilities between what Russia wants from the world and what the West finds acceptable. That has to be the starting point for the dialogue that we've already heard is a good idea, but dialogue without parameters and without an end result in mind is pointless. The first of those parameters has to be working out exactly what is disagreed about and then being honest about it, not only in political circles in the West, but also with populations that have to support those long-term measures that you're talking about.
Valeriy, and I'll say, I remember an hour ago, you said they want to change the world, I think it was?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, anyway, do they?
But regarding the West attitude towards Russia, 3 points. First, to understand what the West does really want from Russia, and to agree inside the West, the first. The second, to borrow from Russia a concept of strategic patience. You have some time to wait. I'm absolutely sure a couple of next years, the situation in Russia will change dramatically. I don't know that in a better direction or in worse, but it will change. And the third is practical. We need to elaborate to restore our normal diplomatic work. I mean, work, for example, with Russian embassy in Washington, D.C., and the U.S. embassy in Moscow, and British embassy in Moscow, and all this stuff. Because we feel a lack of diplomatic contacts now. Normal diplomatic work. Thanks.
Okay, and Christian, the last word is to you.
Thank you. I would just underline what Sandy Vershbow said about strategic patience about Crimea, and I would like to add all other frozen conflicts, Ossetia, Abkhazia, Transnistria. All there is a need for us to develop or have a strategy. If not, we will not, as the West, survive in the way we expect.
Mm-hmm. My goodness, I cannot believe it. It is 0, 0, 0. It's exactly. In the history of all conferences, this has never happened before. But I want to thank our panel very, very much, because I do know actually almost everybody on the panel, and we've known each other for many years. And each time that I hear you, I learn new things. So I'm sure that our audience will join me in thanking you very, very much. Lilia Shevtsova, Alexander Vershbow, Keir Giles, Valeriy Solovej, and Christian Schmidt.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.